Good morning. I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. Um, this is my portion of our Chapter 8 presentation, which is Educational Settings of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. And I'm just going to jump right into it, but please excuse any noise that you may hear throughout my presentation. So we are going to begin with establishing schools for the deaf in America. And to start off, we're going to be talking about Martha's Vineyard. So Martha's Vineyard was an island off of the coast of Massachusetts, and I did provide a picture for anyone who wants to go take a look on our presentation. This island has such a large population of people who were deaf that lived here throughout the 1600s to the 1900s. And it's had such a high population on this island that they ended up creating their own sign language called Martha Vineyard's Sign Language, or MVSL. However, before the 1800s, no educational facilities had been established for deaf children. It wasn't until early 1800s that more educational opportunities and the use of sign language began to emerge. So now we are going to talk about educating deaf students, oral versus manual. All throughout Europe, there was a very strong belief that those individuals who were deaf should be educated orally. So John Baptiste Grazer and Friedrich Martis Hill were both philosophy supporters to the German oralist movement, and this movement was basically something that supported like oral education. In the 1800s, the Convention of American Instructors of the Deaf, or CAID, found that all modes of communication were acceptable in educational settings. And so this means that dozens of schools in America used oral, and others used sign language as a primary mode of communication, and other schools used a mix of both sign and speech. So now we are going to continue on with the topic, educating deaf schools, or deaf students, oral versus manual. We're going to talk about the debate between US and Europe. And the debate was which was the best way to educate deaf students. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Alexander Graham Bell. I know when you think of Alexander Graham Bell, you think about the telephone. However, he played a huge role in the education of deaf students. Alexander Graham Bell was an oralist. He believed that students should be taught orally. He believed that sign language was almost like a foreign language, and that he believed that since America was such an English-speaking country, that English and English only should be taught. So he didn't like sign language, and he actually wanted to keep deaf people apart. He thought that deaf people reproducing was kind of like a contamination to the human race, because he believed that it would produce more deaf people. Even though he married a deaf woman, he wanted to keep deaf people separate, and he didn't want ASL at all. He was more for so as I was saying, he was against ASL. He didn't like it. He wanted everyone to speak orally. He wanted everyone to speak English. And he was strongly against the intermarriage of deaf people, because he believed that, with deaf people creating their own families, this would create more deaf people, even though most deaf people are born to hearing parents. And even though he married a deaf woman himself, he wanted to keep deaf people apart, and he wanted it to be no more sign language. He wanted it to just be straight English and orally. And that's what his mindset was. However, Edward Gallaudet, he fought for a more combined system. He wished to have sign and speech because he wished to preserve sign language, and he didn't want it to be completely gone like Alexander Graham Bell did. He wanted both. However, speech was considered superior over signing, and so this led to the termination of many deaf professionals that were hired by these schools. So interpreters and stuff like that, they lost their jobs because of this. So in 1920, 80% of students were educated without signing. So this means that these students were forced to sit on their hands or even have their hands tied behind their back to prevent them from signing and forcing them to speak orally. However, in the 1960s, signing began to make an appearance again in educational settings. So from 1920s to 1960s, signing was not allowed. And I'm not sure about what was done if, someone was to use sign language, but usually students were forced to sit on their hands or have their hands tied behind their back to prevent them from doing so. So now we're going to talk about educational environments, and we're going to begin with some statistics. So according to the National Center for Education Statistics, 51.9% of students are receiving the majority of their education in regular education settings. 12.3% of students are being taught in residential facilities, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit later. 0.2% of students are being homeschooled, and so with all this, 50% of students rely on sign language, while 47.8% of students use speech as their primary mode of communication. So we're going to continue on with educational environments. So statistics report that those who have attended a public school setting receive support services, such as sign interpreters, oral interpreters, audiologic services, and tutors and tutoring. These educational programs for the deaf of hard of hearing students were categorized into two groups: regular educational programs and special schools. So within the regular educational programs, this includes day schools, resource rooms, and intervention programs. And in the special schools, they included residential facilities, which is something that we'll talk about next. So the residential school programs, they followed the idea of boarding school. They served around 100 to 200 students. These schools offered a number of support services such as counselors, audiologists, and psychologists. So the primary goal of these residential schools were to serve the population of deaf students who lived outside the metropolitan area. These residential schools have employed deaf and hearing teachers and a support staff that were trained for deaf education. So the classes in these residential school programs were usually small in size, and they were designed so that students had access to their teachers at all times. So we're going to continue on talking about residential school programs. So students were provided with various amounts of academic and vocational courses, and as well as a variety of athletic and social programs. These schools recognize the importance of language and expression, so they embraced a number of communication methods such as total communication, the Bye-Bye approach, which is the bilingual and bicultural, and ASL. However, for decades, manually coded English systems were used within these day schools and residential schools too. But however, when these schools required students to sign following the structure of an English word, their reading levels still remained low. So so three professionals in this field, Johnson, Liddell, and Erding, they created a paper titled Unlocking the Curriculum. And I know that on my presentation I made a mistake and it says under the curriculum, but it's actually Unlocking the Curriculum. And these authors basically advocated a change in language used for classroom instruction. They stated that ASL and English should be kept separate, and that they encourage that ASL be the first language when instructing children who are deaf. So residential schools began to peak in the 1970s. About 1/3 of students who attended the residential schools, while others attended special schools. So within this residential school program setting, the school designed the school so that students could have the opportunity to interact with their peers both inside and out the classroom. So this includes, talking to them and interacting with them in their dormitories or the cafeteria or during special events. And so with this opportunity for kids to socialize with each other, this helped build their social skills and also help boost up their self-esteem so that they'll have the confidence to do so. So based on a report by the National Center for Education Statistics in 1999, 16.8% of students who are deaf receive their education in residential or day schools. So now we're going to move on to day schools. Day schools were public schools that were constructed to assist deaf students who lived at home. So not these students who lived in a dormitory at the residential school. These were for students who stayed at home. These were located in metropolitan areas, and just like residential facilities, day schools hired faculty members who are trained to work with the hard of hearing and deaf students. So they still get that support just like the residential school programs. And these day schools, they helped provide an environment for social growth and development to help build the character of their students, just like the residential facilities. So that concludes my portion of the presentation, educational settings of the deaf and hard of hearing. I hope everyone is staying safe and everyone is doing well. Thank you very much for listening to me, and goodbye.